What if the danger wasn't the thing moving toward you, but the moment you realized no one was watching? The lights in the training hall were always too bright. Not harsh, exactly, just precise. Every lumen calibrated to eliminate shadow, every reflection accounted for, every surface designed to show wear honestly. The kind of place that assumed violence would be loud and obvious. The kind of place that had never needed to imagine quiet harm. Harper noticed that first. She always noticed the margins, the scuffed polymer at the edge of the mat where boots landed half a second late, the faint vibration in the floor when the gravity field compensated for station drift, the way voices echoed differently depending on who was speaking. None of it felt threatening. It just felt unfinished, like a calculation that hadn't been checked. She sat cross-legged, stylus moving, posture loose in the way instructors usually warned against. She was aware of at the periphery of her vision, the crystalline instructor's body glowing a patient blue, attention divided between maintenance readouts and the comforting predictability of routine. 4 centuries of teaching had trained to trust structure. If something was wrong, an alarm would sound. If a student was dangerous, the file would say so. Harper's file said nothing. That absence followed her everywhere. Not hostile, just empty. No threat rating, no red flags, no footnotes worth reading aloud. It made her feel lighter than she should have felt, invisible in a way that was almost polite. When the door hissed open, she didn't look up. The sound registered, categorized, dismissed. Another cadet arriving early, another body occupying space. Footsteps were precise, controlled. He carried himself like someone who had been told, often and with authority, that his species was built for combat. Harper noted the rhythm anyway, too deliberate, like someone rehearsing confidence. She felt the shift before the words came, a slight tightening in the air, a change in how the space held sound. Cadet Harper said, carefully courteous, "We were discussing integration." Integration was one of those words that meant different things depending on who said it. Harper had learned that during orientation. Integration could mean cooperation, or assimilation, or correction. She kept writing. "I'm integrated," she said. It wasn't defensive, just factual. She attended. She stayed out of the way. She didn't ask to be noticed. The pause that followed wasn't silence. It was expectation. Somewhere behind her, turned toward a control panel, distracted by a gravity alert that didn't make sense. Harper heard the crystalline fingers move, heard the soft chime of irritation. The instructor's attention shifted, just slightly, in the way authority sometimes did when it trusted systems more than people. That was when the circle closed. Harper didn't think of it as an attack, not at first. It felt like pressure, like standing too close to a crowd that didn't know how to stand still. She sensed motion from 4 directions, felt the air move differently as mass accelerated toward her. She registered angles, distances, timing. And somewhere, very quietly, she felt annoyance. It wasn't fear. Fear would have sharpened things. This was duller than that. A mild irritation at being interrupted mid-sentence, mid-thought. She was halfway through a note about micro-adjustments in gravity variance and their effects on non-human balance. It was an interesting problem. Her hand moved. She didn't stand, didn't brace, didn't change her breathing. There was no decision point she could later identify as the moment everything changed. There was just motion, efficient and brief, like correcting a typo. The sounds came later, impacts layered over one another, a crunch that suggested material meeting resistance it hadn't anticipated, the kind of noise that made people flinch even if they didn't understand why. When Harper looked up again, it was because the room felt wrong. 4 bodies were no longer where they should have been. One was embedded in the floor, gravity pressing him deeper as if the universe had momentarily forgotten its own rules. One hung from the ceiling, mandibles clicking in confusion rather than pain. One slid slowly down the far wall, leaving a mark that would be difficult to clean. The last lay folded in a way anatomy charts didn't allow. Harper blinked once. She glanced at her notes. "Gravity's still off," she said mildly. "Turned too late." The instructor's 4 eyes reflected the scene from slightly different angles, each one catching a version of reality that didn't fit training manuals or experience. Her body color shifted, light fracturing through internal matrices as stress chiming filled the air. "What?" said, not as a question, but as an attempt to stabilize the world through language. "They slipped," Harper said. She wasn't lying. Not exactly. From a certain frame of reference, that's what it would look like. The room held its breath. Somewhere in the ceiling, something groaned. Had taught for 400 years. She had seen ambition, cruelty, panic, brilliance. She had never seen someone sit still at the center of chaos and look vaguely inconvenienced by it. She was already too late. Why didn't the alarms trigger sooner? That was the question kept returning to, even as medical teams flooded the facility and the smell of antiseptic replaced the sharp tang of ozone and stress. Systems were supposed to notice anomalies. Violence left data trails. Force registered. Energy spikes announced themselves. But the readouts were clean. Harper sat on a bench, exactly where she'd been told to sit, stylus moving with the same unhurried rhythm. The injured groaned softly nearby. The sound barely reached her awareness. She was cataloging, replaying events with the calm detachment she'd learned growing up in places where accidents happened without warning and panic made things worse. Watched her from across the room, crystalline posture rigid with restraint. The instructor's internal conflict wasn't fear, not yet. It was something closer to professional betrayal. The galaxy had rules. Those rules were old, tested, reliable. Species fit into categories. Training followed progression. Threats escalated predictably. Harper didn't fit. "Did you move?" asked finally. Harper looked up. The question seemed to surprise her, not because it was unexpected, but because it felt oddly irrelevant. "I don't think so," she said. "I mean, I adjusted." Stood nearby, antenna trembling. He tried to speak twice before sound came out. "She didn't stand," he said. "She didn't even look at us." Attention snapped to him. "Explain." "I can't," admitted. His mandibles clicked in distress. "I saw her hand, or maybe I didn't, it was just suddenly different." Different, not faster, not stronger, just elsewhere. Initiated a reflex test. Simple, controlled. A sphere tossed slowly through the air designed to measure baseline response time. Harper caught it. No blur, no anticipation. One moment her hand was at her side. The next, it held the sphere as if it had always been there. Tried again, faster. Harper caught it without looking up. A flicker of something cold passed through the instructor's matrices. Not panic, recognition. "On Earth," Harper said when stared too long, "we learned to listen." That should not have been enough. The medic cleared his throat, bringing up data Harper hadn't known was missing. Hostile environment indices, gravity values, evolutionary pressures. The words Deathworld hung in the air like an accusation no one had intended to make. Felt the ground shift under centuries of assumption. Harper listened, brow furrowing slightly. "Those numbers are conservative," she said. "Most people I know push harder than that." Silence followed, heavy, thoughtful. Realize then that this wasn't about aggression, or dominance, or even power. It was about calibration. The galaxy had underestimated scale, had mistaken restraint for weakness, had read politeness as incapacity. And Harper, quiet, diligent, unremarkable Harper, had never thought to correct the record. What happens when someone doesn't know they're dangerous? The question surfaced later in his office after reports were filed that explained nothing and explained it convincingly. Gravity fluctuations, equipment error, a cascade of small failures, lies carefully shaped to protect systems that weren't ready for the truth. Harper sat across from her, posture attentive. She looked tired now, not physically, something deeper. The fatigue of someone realizing slowly that the rules everyone else lived by did not apply in the same way. "I don't want special treatment," Harper said quietly. "I just want to finish the course." Studied her, 4 eyes, 4 angles, none sufficient. "You don't get to choose that," she said. "Not anymore." That wasn't a threat. It was an acknowledgement of responsibility, of consequence. Training changed, schedules shifted, distances were enforced. Harper trained alone under supervision that bordered on reverence, not because she demanded it, because everyone else needed it. She learned control the way others learned technique, by slowing down, by understanding margins, by practicing restraint until it felt unnatural. It was harder than anything she'd done before. Sometimes, late in the empty hall, she wondered what would happen if she ever did feel truly afraid. The thought unsettled her more than the incident ever had. Watched her grow, not stronger but more precise. The instructor had spent centuries teaching others how to survive. Now she was teaching one student how not to destroy. The galaxy adjusted slowly. Files were amended, categories expanded, warning labels rewritten in language that tried not to sound like fear. Harper kept taking notes. The lights stayed bright, the mats showed new scuffs, the systems learned eventually what to watch for. And somewhere in the quiet between lessons, a question lingered without answer. What else had the galaxy misunderstood, simply because it had arrived too late? Why did the room feel smaller when nothing in it had changed? Harper noticed it during the third afternoon session, when the training hall had been cleared of everyone except her and same lights, same mats, same faint hum from the gravity system holding the station together, and yet the space felt compressed, as if the walls had learned something and were quietly adjusting their expectations. Stood farther away than necessary, not out of fear, at least not consciously, but out of calculation. Distance was a variable now, one she hadn't known to include before. "Begin with awareness drills," the instructor said, voice steady, crystalline tone carefully neutral. "No movement, no response, just perception." Harper nodded and sat down, cross-legged, exactly as before. The position had become a problem in itself. Felt a flicker of irritation at that, at how an innocuous posture had been reclassified as dangerous simply because of who occupied it. Harper closed her eyes. At first nothing happened. No sudden insight, no dramatic shift, just breathing, slow, even. The kind drilled into her during childhood safety courses when instructors taught students how not to panic during earthquakes, fires, system failures. Earth had been good at teaching people how to wait inside danger. "I want you to tell me when you sense movement," said. "Okay." Didn't move. She waited, 30 seconds, a minute. The silence stretched, broken only by the faint click of cooling systems. Harper's brow furrowed slightly, not with effort but with concentration that bordered on boredom. "You're going to step to your left," Harper said suddenly. "In about 2 seconds." Froze. Then, against her better judgment, she did exactly that. Harper opened one eye. "Your weight shifted before your foot did," she said. "You redistribute mass differently when you're uncertain." Internal matrices pulsed. She hadn't realized she was uncertain. That was the problem. The drills continued, micro-movements, feints that weren't meant to deceive, only to test perception. Harper identified them all, not instantly, but consistently. She was slower than the species engineered for combat reflexes, slower than the ones bred for war, but she was never wrong. Accuracy over speed. It was a familiar trade-off, one Harper had grown up with, though she'd never named it that way. On Earth, misjudging timing could mean a cracked skull, a crushed limb, a storm surge that didn't forgive hesitation. People learned to read signs because reacting late was worse than reacting slowly. Recorded everything: angles, delays, physiological readouts that insisted Harper's heart rate remained within normal parameters. No adrenaline spike, no heightened stress response. "You don't feel threatened," said finally. Harper shrugged. "I feel alert." "That should not be enough." "It usually is." Didn't argue. She was beginning to understand that argument required shared assumptions, and those were in short supply. The real tension arrived later, not during drills but during review. They sat across from one another in his office, the walls lined with holographic plaques commemorating species cohorts long since graduated, names that had once mattered, conflicts that had felt urgent at the time. Brought up the footage. Harper watched herself on the recording with mild curiosity. The angle was wrong, too wide. It missed the subtlety of the moment, flattened everything into crude cause and effect. She winced, not at the violence but at how imprecise it looked. "I don't like that," she said quietly. "What?" asked. "That version of me." Harper leaned forward slightly. "It makes it look like I wasn't paying attention." His four eyes narrowed. "You incapacitated 4 cadets." "I know," Harper said. "That's why I should have been more careful." The instructor felt something twist inside her matrices. Guilt, perhaps, or the uncomfortable realization that Harper's internal standard was higher than the galaxy's external one. "Why didn't you report your capabilities?" asked. "During intake, orientation, any of the assessments?" Harper was quiet for a long moment. When she spoke, her voice was lower, more grounded. "Because no one asked the right questions," she said. "They asked if I'd been trained. I hadn't. They asked if I'd fought. I hadn't. They asked for numbers that made sense to them." "And you didn't think to volunteer more?" Harper hesitated. "On Earth, if you walk into a room and announce you're dangerous, people assume you want to be." Absorb that slowly. Cultural divergence, not just in physiology, but in ethics, in restraint shaped by history rather than law. "You were jumped," said, "targeted." Harper nodded. "Yes." "And you don't seem angry about it." "I am," Harper said, surprising them both, "just not at them." "Then at whom?" Harper looked at the paused image on the screen. 4 bodies mid-fall. Herself seated at the center, hand barely visible. "At the system," she said. "It keeps putting people in positions where they think they need to prove something." That answer stayed with long after Harper left. The reports escalated. Quietly, at first, committees requested clarification. Risk assessments were revised. The phrase "instructor arrived too late" appeared in internal memos, stripped of blame but heavy with implication. Attended the hearings alone. Harper was deliberately excluded, not as punishment but as containment. The council chambers were not built to accommodate unknown variables. "She should have been flagged," one voice insisted. "She should never have been placed in a mixed-species combat environment," said another. Listened, crystalline posture rigid, internal matrices steady through sheer discipline. When they finished, she spoke only once. "You are all assuming intent," she said. "You are all wrong." That unsettled them more than anger would have. Training resumed under new constraints, more distance, more oversight. Harper without complaint. If anything, she seemed relieved by the structure. Limits clarified responsibility. They always had. Yet something had shifted between her and, not distrust, not fear, something closer to shared burden. One evening, as the lights dimmed to station night levels, asked a question she hadn't planned to ask. "Do you ever worry," she said, "about what would happen if you stopped holding back?" Harper considered it, really considered it. "Yes," she said, "that's why I keep notes." Didn't understand immediately. Harper smiled faintly. "So I can remind myself where the line is, even when no one else sees it." Outside the training hall, the station continued its routines. Trade flowed. Alliances held. The galaxy adjusted its margins by fractions of a percent, unaware of how close it had come to a larger. And in a quiet room designed for controlled violence, a student learned not how to fight, but how to exist carefully in a universe that had only just realized what it had underestimated. At what point does caution become its own kind of danger? The first sign came from outside the training hall. Harper noticed it as she was leaving a late session. The corridor lights dimmed to station night, footsteps echoing farther than they should have. She paused, not because she sensed pursuit, but because the rhythm felt rehearsed. Someone matching pace too precisely. Someone trying not to be noticed by being careful instead of natural. She stopped. The footsteps stopped too, half a second too late. Harper didn't turn around. She didn't tense. She simply exhaled, slow and controlled, the way she'd learned when crossing unstable ground back home. When she spoke, her voice carried just enough to reach the end of the corridor. "You don't have to do this," she said. Silence answered. Then a voice, unfamiliar, filtered through a translator with a slight delay. "We only want to understand." Harper closed her eyes briefly. Understanding was rarely what followed situations like this. Had warned her, not explicitly. The instructor never said you are being watched. She didn't have to. The change in schedules, the sudden presence of observers who pretended to be maintenance staff, the way requests for data without clear purpose, it all pointed in the same direction. Curiosity had turned sharp. Harper turned at last. Two figures stood several meters back, station security by posture if not uniform. Their hands were visible. Their stances were cautious in the way of people who knew, abstractly, that something was wrong but hadn't yet accepted how wrong. "You should talk to my instructor," Harper said. "That's the protocol." "We tried," one of them replied. "She declined." That didn't surprise Harper. Declined many things lately. Requests for demonstrations, invitations to panels, quiet suggestions that controlled displays of capability might reassure the council. Reassurance, Harper had learned, often meant spectacle. "I'm tired," Harper said, "and I don't like being followed." The two exchanged a glance. A decision passed between them, quick and subtle. Harper saw it anyway, not because she was fast, but because she'd seen it before in other contexts on other worlds. They stepped forward. Harper moved. Later, the official report would describe the encounter as a misunderstanding resolved without injury. That was technically true. No one was hurt. No alarms sounded. The corridor cameras recorded nothing out of tolerance. From the outside, it looked like a conversation that ended awkwardly. From the inside, it felt like restraint stretched to its limit. Harper didn't throw a strike. She didn't grab or push. She adjusted distance, redirected momentum, applied just enough force to make intentions collapse under their own weight. When it was over, the two officers found themselves seated on the floor, disoriented, breathing hard, their hands still visible because Harper had gently, but firmly, placed them there. "You should document this," she told them, "accurately." They didn't respond. They were still recalibrating their understanding of personal space. Harper walked away before arrived. The instructor heard about it an hour later. She stood in her office, crystalline arms braced against the desk, listening as fragmented reports assembled themselves into a picture she didn't like. Not because of what Harper had done, but because of why it had happened. "They approached her alone," said quietly, "without clearance." "They were acting under provisional authority," the administrator replied. "Risk mitigation." Internal matrices flared. You do not mitigate risk by provoking it. The silence that followed was brittle. "They're afraid," the administrator admitted at last. "So am I," said. "That's not an excuse." She found Harper later in the training hall, sitting exactly where she always sat, stylus moving, expression neutral. The quiet between them was heavier than usual. "You handled it," said. "Yes. You shouldn't have had to." Harper paused, considering whether that was true. "On Earth," she said slowly, "we assume systems fail eventually, so we plan for the moment they do." Lowered herself into a rest position, crystalline structure dimming slightly. "You are becoming a contingency." Harper looked up. There was no pride in her expression, only concern. "I don't want to be," she said. That was the most dangerous thing she could have said. The council sessions intensified. Words like containment and special classification entered official vocabulary. A new proposal circulated quietly, suggesting Harper be transferred to a secure research facility. For her protection, the wording insisted. Read it twice, then a third time. When she spoke to the council again, her voice carried none of the patience she was known for. "You are reacting to fear with bureaucracy," she said, "and bureaucracy is slow." "She represents an unknown variable," a counselor replied. "So did every species you now rely on," said. "The difference is that this one is choosing restraint." "Until she doesn't." Leaned forward, crystalline facets catching the chamber light. "If that moment comes," she said, "your protocols will not save you. The only thing that will is trust, and you are dismantling it." The vote was deferred, not deferred. Harper sensed the shift immediately, not in policy, but in atmosphere. People avoided her more carefully now. Conversations stopped when she entered a room, then resumed too loudly. Fear had replaced curiosity, and fear was louder. She trained harder, slower, practicing movements she hoped never to need, counting breaths, measuring pressure, learning with growing unease just how little margin there was between control and catastrophe. One night alone in the hall, she finally stopped writing. She stared at her hands for a long time. Found her like that, unmoving datapad dark. "What are you thinking?" the instructor asked. Harper didn't answer immediately. When she did, her voice was quiet. "I'm thinking about what happens when being careful isn't enough," she said, "and whether the galaxy is ready for someone who knows exactly how dangerous they could be and chooses not to be anyway." Had no answer. Outside, the station drifted on, secure in its routines. Inside, lines were being drawn that no one had intended to draw. And somewhere between fear and restraint, a question continued to grow, unanswered and increasingly urgent. How long can quiet control survive in a system built to respond only after something breaks? Who decides when restraint becomes negligence? The notice arrived without ceremony. No alarms, no urgent summons, just a formal message routed through official channels, its language precise enough to sound neutral, careful enough to disguise intent. Harper read it twice, then a third time, searching for the part where it admitted what it was really asking. Mandatory evaluation, remote facility, temporary reassignment. Temporary was doing a lot of work. She forwarded the message to without comment. Received it while reviewing training metrics that no longer behaved the way metrics were supposed to. Harper's outputs were too consistent, too stable. Systems liked variation. Variation was how anomalies were identified. Harper had learned to smooth her performance just enough to disappear inside the averages. The instructor recognized the tactic immediately. It was the same one she'd used centuries earlier, when her own species had first entered council space and learned that standing out too much invited intervention. Survival through moderation, through being less than one could be. Closed the file. She did not respond to the council. Instead, she went to the training hall. Harper was already there. She always was, sitting on the mat, back straight, eyes unfocused in the way of someone listening to more than what was present. "They're sending me away," Harper said without preamble. "Yes," replied. "Are you going to stop it?" Hesitated. The pause was small. Harper noticed it anyway. "I don't know if I can," the instructor said honestly. Harper nodded. "Then I should prepare." "That's not what I meant." Harper looked up. "It's what I heard." The silence that followed was not empty. It was crowded with implications neither of them wanted to voice. The council's fear was metastasizing. Fear sought distance. Distance created ignorance. Ignorance justified further fear. A clean loop, elegant, dangerous. They want to measure you, said, under controlled conditions. They already are, Harper replied, just badly. Felt something tighten inside her matrices. You are not a specimen. I know, Harper said, that's why I'm worried. Preparation took an unexpected form. Altered the curriculum, not officially, not on record. Exercises became less about technique and more about judgment. Scenarios without optimal outcomes. Problems where every option carried cost. Harper adapted quickly but not comfortably. You hesitate more now, observed during one session. I'm thinking, Harper said. That can get you killed. It can also stop me from killing someone else. Had no rebuttal for that. The day before the transfer, the training hall was empty again. No observers, no monitoring drones, just the hum of systems and the faint echo of a place that had learned to expect violence but was still unprepared for consequence. Stood across from Harper, crystalline body dimmed to a subdued blue. I need to see your limits, she said. Harper stiffened. Why? Because if they push you, said, I need to know where the edge is. Harper considered refusing. The thought crossed her mind and lingered longer than it should have. Refusal would be safer. It would preserve uncertainty. Uncertainty was a shield. But wasn't asking out of fear. She was asking out of responsibility. Okay, Harper said, but you have to promise something. What? If I tell you to stop, Harper said quietly, you stop asking. Inclined her head, agreed. They began slowly, movements measured, distance closing in increments too small to register on most sensors. Harper responded with restraint so precise it bordered on delicate, redirecting force, absorbing momentum, letting feel the difference between resistance and refusal. Again, said. They repeated the exchange, faster this time, not enough to be dangerous, enough to be honest. On the third pass, miscalculated. It was a minor error, a shift in angle that assumed Harper would yield in a way she no longer did. The instructor corrected mid-motion, but too late. Harper caught her. Not roughly, not even firmly, just enough. The training hall groaned. The sound was subtle, a vibration through the reinforced floor, a complaint from materials rated well beyond normal tolerance. Harper felt it through her bones and froze instantly, releasing as if burned. I said stop, Harper said, voice tight. Staggered back, crystalline structure flaring in startled color. The instructor looked down at the faint fracture lines spidering across the mat beneath her feet. They had not been there before. I didn't mean, began. I know, Harper said. She was breathing harder now, not from exertion, from proximity. That was the edge. Not strength, not speed, proximity to loss of control. They stood there for a long moment, both understanding the same thing at once. This is why they're afraid, said softly. No, Harper replied. This is why they should be careful. The transfer shuttle arrived the next morning. Harper packed lightly. She always had. There was very little she needed that the station could take away. Walked with her to the docking ring, the corridor wide and empty by design. At the airlock, Harper stopped. If they ask me to demonstrate, she said, what should I do? His answer came without hesitation. Tell them no, she said. And if they insist, tell them you are still learning control. And if they don't accept that? His internal matrices pulsed, steady and resolute. Then they are not ready to evaluate you. Harper smiled faintly. Neither am I. The airlock cycled. The shuttle waited, impersonal and quiet. As Harper stepped inside, she felt it again, that compression. The sense that the universe was drawing a boundary and daring her to cross it. She didn't look back. Watched the shuttle depart, crystalline hands clenched just enough to leave marks in the rail. For the first time in 400 years of teaching, she realized the lesson might not be about how to fight. It might be about how to be trusted with power, and what happens when institutions demand proof before they're prepared for the answer. The station resumed its routines, but the quiet had changed, and somewhere beyond controlled space, a student carried restraint with her like a promise and a warning. What happens when restraint is tested by a room designed to remove it? The facility did not announce itself as a prison. Harper noticed that immediately. The corridors were wide, the lighting warm, the materials chosen for comfort rather than control. Everything about the place suggested cooperation, transparency, safety. It was the kind of environment built by committees that believed intention mattered more than outcome. That belief worried her. She was escorted, not restrained, observed, not confined. The staff spoke softly and avoided standing too close, as if distance itself were a courtesy. Harper matched their tone, their pace, their expectations. She had learned long ago that compliance, when chosen deliberately, could be a form of control. Still, something in her chest remained tight. The evaluation chamber was circular, lined with adaptive panels and sensor arrays tuned to extremes Harper suspected they didn't fully understand. The room hummed faintly, adjusting itself in response to her presence. Gravity normalized. Atmosphere compensated. Every system eager to prove it was sufficient. Harper stood at the center and waited. A voice spoke from behind the panels, calm and carefully modulated. "Cadet Harper, thank you for your cooperation." "You didn't give me much choice," Harper replied. There was a pause, not offended, just recalibrating. "This assessment is precautionary," the voice said. "We want to understand your limits so we can ensure appropriate placement." Harper closed her eyes briefly. Limits were only meaningful if both sides agreed on what they were measuring. "I'm not a weapon," she said. "No one is suggesting you are." "That's exactly what you're suggesting," Harper replied. "You just don't want to say it out loud." Silence followed. The panels shifted slightly, their surface textures smoothing, as if the room itself were uneasy. "Begin with baseline movement," the voice instructed. Harper moved. Slowly, deliberately, each step measured. She felt the sensors adjust, tracking in pressure and timing. The room responded with polite efficiency. Everything remained within tolerance. "Increase speed." She did, marginally. Enough to satisfy the request without revealing anything new. Harper was acutely aware of the invisible audience beyond the panels, watching data streams and waiting for deviation. They wanted a threshold, something to label. Again, the voice said, "Faster." Harper stopped. "No," she said. This time, the silence was not polite. "Cadet," the voice said, firmer now, "this is a controlled environment." "That doesn't mean it's safe," Harper replied. "For you, perhaps." "For everyone else," Harper corrected. A murmur rippled behind the panels. A discussion, hastily muted. Harper waited, breathing slow, posture relaxed in a way that masked how carefully she was holding herself together. "Demonstrate defensive response," the voice said at last. "Non-lethal parameters." A drone emerged from the wall, sleek, unassuming. Its movement pattern was erratic enough to simulate threat without committing to it. Harper tracked it automatically, her awareness widening to encompass the room. The drone advanced. Harper redirected, let its momentum carry it harmlessly past her. She did not strike, did not grab. She treated it the way one treated unstable terrain, acknowledging danger without challenging it. The drone recalibrated, accelerated. Harper felt the shift immediately. This was no longer simulation. This was escalation justified by curiosity. "Stop," she said. The drone did not stop. Harper exhaled. The movement that followed was still restrained, but barely. A precise redirection applied at exactly the wrong angle for the drone's internal compensators. It struck the wall and deactivated, systems overloaded by force they had not been designed to absorb. The room went very still. Harper stood where she was, hands at her sides, heart rate elevated now, not from exertion but from something closer to anger. Not hot, cold, focused. "You see," she said quietly, "this is why I said no." The panels retracted slightly. A figure stepped into the chamber at last, an evaluator, posture rigid, eyes wide with something that might have been awe or fear. "That was within acceptable parameters," he said, though his voice betrayed uncertainty. "No," Harper replied, "it was." She turned to face him fully. For the first time since arriving, she let a fraction of her attention sharpen, not toward violence but toward presence. The effect was immediate. The evaluator took an involuntary step back. "I am choosing restraint," Harper said. "You are treating it like an invitation." He swallowed. "We have to consider the broader implications." "So do I," Harper said, "every time I enter a room." The evaluation ended shortly after that. Officially, it was inconclusive. Unofficially, it had confirmed what some of them already feared and others refused to articulate. Harper was escorted back to her quarters, still unrestrained, still polite. That night she didn't sleep. She sat on the narrow bed, hands resting loosely in her lap, and thought about the training hall, about the fractured lines in the mat and how close she'd come to something she didn't want to name. For the first time, doubt crept in, not about her control but about the system around her. If restraint was invisible, how long before someone decided it didn't exist? The answer came sooner than she expected. The following day the proposal arrived, this time framed as opportunity rather than necessity. A special task force, controlled deployment, her presence framed as deterrence, not threat. They wanted to use her. Harper read the document slowly, each word settling heavier than the last. This wasn't fear anymore. It was adaptation, the galaxy learning the wrong lesson. She forwarded the message too. The reply came almost immediately. "Do not accept anything you cannot walk away from." Harper closed her eyes. For the first time since leaving the station, she felt something crack, not in her control but in her patience. She stood and looked at her reflection in the darkened paneling. An ordinary human, regulation uniform, nothing about her suggested catastrophe. And yet, she understood now what it meant. Restraint, once noticed, became a resource. And resources were always exploited. Harper straightened, shoulders squaring not in preparation for violence but for decision. If the galaxy insisted on testing her limits, she would have to decide where to place them herself. Not because she wanted power, but because no one else seemed willing to carry the weight of it responsibly. Outside her quarters, the facility hummed on, confident in its safeguards. Inside, a student from a quiet began to understand that survival was no longer the question. The question was whether the galaxy could learn restraint fast enough to match her own. When restraint becomes a choice rather than a habit, who bears responsibility for what follows? Harper did not answer the proposal immediately. That alone unsettled them. In systems built on hierarchy, silence was read as defiance or weakness. They were accustomed to refusal that sounded like protest or acceptance wrapped in gratitude. Harper offered neither. She continued her routines, attended evaluations, ate when scheduled, slept when exhaustion finally overruled vigilance. Outwardly, nothing changed. Internally, something had settled. She stopped thinking in terms of permission. The realization came quietly late in the cycle, as she sat on the floor of her quarters with her back against the wall, listening to the station's structural hum. On Earth, that sound would have meant safety, proof that the building was still standing, that systems were holding. Here, it meant surveillance, continuity, control. She understood then that restraint imposed from the outside was no longer restraint at all. It was compliance. True restraint had to be chosen, rechosen every time. The reply she sent was brief. She declined. No justification, no conditions, just a clear statement that she would not participate in deployments, demonstrations, or deterrence operations. She cited her current status as a student. She emphasized ongoing training. She left no opening for negotiation. The response was not immediate. When it came, it was colder. Access privileges adjusted, movement corridors reassigned, not confinement, never that, but narrowing, subtle pressure applied by people who believed they were being careful. Harper felt it immediately, not as threat but as friction. Arrived 2 days later, unannounced. The instructor's crystalline form filled the doorway of the evaluation wing, facets dimmed to a controlled blue that barely masked strain. 400 years of composure carried behind every step, but Harper could hear it in the way her stress chiming lagged half a beat behind her movements. "They are making a mistake," said without greeting. "Yes," Harper replied, "but not the one they think." They walked together through a quiet corridor, far from observers. The station seemed to lean away from them, as if instinctively increasing distance. "You could leave," said, "I can make that happen." Harper stopped. For the first time since arriving at the facility, she turned fully toward her instructor. "If I leave now," she said, "they learn the wrong lesson. Matrices pulsed, and if you stay." "They might still learn the wrong lesson," Harper said, "but I'll be here to correct it." They stood there, student and instructor, bound by a responsibility neither of them had asked for. Saw it then, not the danger Harper represented, but the cost she was carrying by choosing not to be it. "You shouldn't have to do this," said quietly. "I know," Harper replied, "but I can." That was the difference. The incident that followed was never officially named. A systems failure, a localized panic, conflicting reports that refused to align. What mattered was that a security protocol activated prematurely in a civilian transit ring, sealing doors and compressing space where it should not have been compressed. People were trapped. Fear escalated. Command hesitated, unwilling to deploy force and unwilling to stand down. Harper arrived before anyone authorized her to. She moved through the crowd without urgency, voice steady, presence grounding in a way no announcement ever had. She redirected bodies the way she had redirected momentum, small adjustments, careful spacing, just enough pressure to keep panic from folding inward. When a door failed and mass surged, she braced it. Not with effort, with decision. The structure held. Later analysis would show that the forces involved exceeded safety tolerances by orders of magnitude, that the materials should have failed, that nothing in the design accounted for a human standing in the wrong place at the right moment and refusing to move. No one was injured. The report described it as exceptional situational response. That phrasing was deliberate. It avoided words like strength, avoided capacity, avoided admitting that restraint, when chosen under pressure, was more powerful than any deterrent they had tried to build. Afterward, the facility loosened. Not formally, not all at once, but corridors widened, privileges returned. The proposal was quietly withdrawn. Committees rewrote their conclusions in language that suggested prudence rather than retreat. Harper returned to training. She took notes again, on stress responses, on crowd dynamics, on how systems failed not because they were weak, but because they assumed force would always announce itself loudly. Resumed teaching as well, but her lessons changed. She stopped asking what students could do. She began asking what they chose not to do, and why. The galaxy did not become safer overnight. Institutions rarely learned that quickly, but something subtle shifted in how humans were discussed. Less speculation, more caution. Not fear, respect, hesitant and incomplete. Harper remained unclassified. Not because they couldn't categorize her, but because no category could account for someone who carried overwhelming capability and treated it as an ethical burden rather than an asset. On her last day at the facility before returning to standard coursework, Harper stood alone in the training hall one final time. Same lights, same mats, the faint fracture lines long since repaired. She sat cross-legged and wrote. Not about strength, not about combat. About restraint as a practice. About how silence could be louder than force. About the responsibility of those who could act and chose not to unless it mattered. When she finished, she closed the pad and looked up. For the first time since she'd arrived, the room felt properly sized. Not because it had changed, but because it finally understood who was standing inside it.